The Secret War Beneath the Southern Sky. For decades, official records claimed that nothing of strategic importance ever happened in the quiet red deserts of Central Australia during the Second World War. But that was never entirely true. In the early 1940s, while the world burned across Europe and Asia, something was unfolding beneath the vast southern sky. Something hidden not only from the enemy, but from most Australians themselves. This is the untold story of Australia's secret inland war. When Japan entered World War II in December 1941, Australia's geographic isolation suddenly felt fragile. Darwin was bombed in February 1942. Submarines entered Sydney Harbor. Panic spread across the continent. The government feared invasion. Military planners began preparing for a worst-case scenario. If the Japanese landed on the northern coast, how would Australia defend itself? The coastline was vulnerable, the population was small, infrastructure was thin. But Australia had one advantage few nations possessed: distance. The vast, harsh, unforgiving interior. And so, deep in the Northern Territory and Central Australia, a series of emergency operations began, many of which remained classified for decades. The Inland Line. Military strategists quietly developed what was known as the Brisbane Line concept, a controversial defensive strategy that proposed abandoning large parts of northern Australia if invasion occurred, retreating to a defensible line stretching across the continent. Though publicly denied at the time, internal discussions reveal serious contingency planning. Supplies were moved inland. Airstrips were carved out of desert earth. Remote depots were constructed and camouflaged. Rail lines became lifelines. Alice Springs, once a remote outpost, transformed into a strategic hub. Troop trains arrived under cover of darkness. Fuel reserves were buried. Communication outposts were installed across remote Aboriginal lands. And here is where the hidden story deepens. Aboriginal knowledge, silent contribution. Much of the military's success in navigating the interior depended on Indigenous Australians. Aboriginal stockmen, trackers, and guides possessed knowledge of terrain that no map could replicate. They knew where waterholes survived drought. They understood desert weather patterns. They could read the land like a living text. In many cases, Indigenous men worked alongside Australian and American forces, building roads, maintaining supply routes, and guiding patrols. Yet their contributions were rarely recorded. Some elders later spoke of strange movements across sacred lands during the war. Foreign soldiers, massive machines, and hidden stockpiles appearing in areas previously untouched by industrial activity. For communities who had survived frontier violence decades earlier, this was another wave of outsiders, though this time the threat came from the sky. The American presence. By 1942, over 1 million American troops passed through Australia during the Pacific War. Northern and central regions saw quiet military buildup. Airfields were constructed in secrecy. Radar stations appeared in remote bushland. Camouflage netting covered aircraft from reconnaissance. Pine Gap would not exist until decades later, but wartime intelligence operations laid the foundation for future strategic cooperation between Australia and the United States. Inland Australia was becoming more than a defensive fallback. It was becoming a strategic shield. The ghost airstrips. Recently declassified documents revealed dozens of emergency airstrips built across outback Queensland and the Northern Territory. Many were simple dirt runways, invisible from a distance. pilots trained for emergency landings in case coastal bases were destroyed. Some locals recall seeing aircraft land in areas that now appear empty and forgotten. After the war, many of these sites were abandoned, reclaimed by dust and spinifex grass. Few signs remain. But satellite imagery has confirmed the outlines of these forgotten wartime runways. The fear of invasion. In 1942, Australia felt closer to invasion than ever before. Propaganda posters warned civilians to prepare. Children practiced air raid drills. Windows were blacked out at night. The bombing of Darwin, often called Australia's Pearl Harbor, killed over 240 people. It was the largest attack ever mounted by a foreign power on Australian soil. Yet Darwin was only part of the story. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft reportedly flew over northern interior regions, mapping terrain. Australian forces feared paratrooper landings. The desert was no longer empty. It was a potential battlefield. Secrets buried in sand. During the height of the war, weapons depots were established in isolated areas to prevent catastrophic losses if coastal cities fell. Explosives, fuel drums, ammunition crates, some buried deliberately, others abandoned in haste. Even today, occasional discoveries surface during mining operations, rusted wartime artifacts in places no battle officially occurred. Local oral histories in the Northern Territory tell of mysterious convoys that vanished into desert horizons. Some stories speak of training exercises so secret that local civilians were warned away without explanation. War leaves marks, even when no bullets are fired. The aftermath. When the war ended in 1945, much of this infrastructure was dismantled. Troops left. Equipment was sold or scrapped. The desert returned to silence. But the experience permanently altered Australia's defense strategy. The realization that the continent was not immune to global conflict reshaped foreign policy. It strengthened the alliance with the United States. It accelerated northern development. It influenced post-war immigration policies aimed at increasing population under the slogan, "Populate or perish." The hidden inland war had long-term consequences. Why it remained untold? Unlike Gallipoli or Kokoda, there was no singular dramatic battle in the desert interior. No iconic photograph, no cinematic charge. Instead, there was preparation, fear, logistics, strategy, and quiet cooperation across cultures. History often celebrates explosions, but sometimes the most important chapters are written in silence. Australia's vast red centre holds more than ancient songlines and geological wonders. It holds the memory of a nation preparing for survival. The story was never entirely erased. It was simply overshadowed. And beneath the southern sky, where stars burn brighter than anywhere else, the land still remembers. As the immediate threat of invasion began to ease after the turning points of 1943, many Australians believed the danger had passed entirely. Yet inland operations did not simply dissolve into obscurity. Instead, they evolved. What had begun as emergency defensive preparation slowly transformed into a more structured strategic network that would influence Australia's military posture for decades. Supply depots remained active, communication lines were reinforced rather than dismantled, and several inland airstrips continued operating as training facilities. The desert had proven its value, not as a battlefield, but as a secure depth of territory that adversaries could neither easily penetrate nor fully understand. Military planners recognized that geography itself was one of Australia's greatest assets. The sheer scale of the continent, combined with its harsh climate, created a natural defensive buffer. However, geography alone was not enough. The war had exposed weaknesses in infrastructure, inadequate roads, fragile rail networks, limited northern development. In response, post-1943 planning began focusing not only on winning the war abroad, but on ensuring the continent would never again feel so vulnerable. American engineers, working alongside Australian units, improved airfields and upgraded logistical systems across inland Queensland and the Northern Territory. Some installations were intentionally understated, designed to blend with the landscape. Camouflage techniques refined during the war later influenced Cold War construction philosophy, where concealment and redundancy became central doctrines. Beneath the surface, intelligence coordination deepened. Signals units operating from remote stations intercepted and monitored transmissions across the Pacific. Temporary listening posts, set up far from urban centers to avoid interference, became prototypes for more permanent intelligence infrastructure after 1945. Although the war officially ended with Japan's surrender, the strategic anxiety it produced did not vanish overnight. Instead, it reshaped Australia's understanding of its place in the Asia-Pacific region. The continent was no longer viewed simply as an outpost of the British Empire. It had become a frontline state in a rapidly shifting geopolitical environment. Indigenous involvement during the later war years also expanded quietly. In northern coastal regions, Aboriginal patrol units were formed to monitor remote shorelines for suspicious activity. These groups combined traditional tracking expertise with military coordination, offering surveillance capabilities unmatched by conventional forces. Yet official acknowledgement remained minimal. Many Indigenous participants returned to communities that still faced discriminatory laws and restricted rights. Their wartime service, though real and significant, did not immediately translate into social equality. The contrast between contribution and recognition became one of the lingering moral tensions of the era. Economically, the inland mobilization accelerated resource mapping. Geological surveys conducted under wartime urgency identified mineral deposits previously undocumented. After 1945, these findings contributed to mining expansion, particularly in uranium and other strategic materials essential for emerging nuclear technologies. Thus, the hidden war effort indirectly fed into Australia's role in the early atomic age. Some historians argue that without the emergency mapping programs initiated during World War II, later industrial development in the interior would have progressed far more slowly. Socially, the war left subtler transformations. Inland towns that had once been isolated gained improved transport links and modest population growth. American cultural influence, music, slang, food, filtered into communities that had rarely encountered foreign visitors. While coastal cities experienced the most visible changes, even remote settlements felt the ripple effects of global conflict. Children who grew up watching military convoys rumble past red dust roads later became part of a generation more outward-looking and strategically conscious than their predecessors. Politically, the shock of 1942 permanently altered defense policy. Australia strengthened its alliance with the United States, eventually formalized in the ANZUS Treaty of 1951. The idea that distant imperial protection alone could guarantee safety had been fundamentally challenged. Inland defense thinking evolved into a doctrine emphasizing northern surveillance and rapid mobility. Air power, radar coverage, and intelligence sharing became central pillars of national security. Facilities established in later decades, including joint defense installations in Central Australia, can trace conceptual ancestry to the emergency preparations of the early 1940s. Yet, despite these long-term consequences, public memory continued to focus primarily on overseas campaigns. Kokoda, Tobruk, and Gallipoli dominated commemorations. The inland mobilization remained a logistical footnote rather than a narrative centerpiece. Perhaps this was because no dramatic invasion occurred. The absence of catastrophe made it easy to overlook the effort that helped prevent one. History often celebrates what happens, not what is successfully avoided. Archival declassifications in recent decades have gradually illuminated the scope of inland wartime planning. Government memoranda reveal contingency evacuation routes, fallback industrial strategies, and even proposals to relocate critical manufacturing deeper into the continent if coastal cities fell. Railway workshops were identified as essential assets. Inland fuel storage was carefully dispersed to reduce vulnerability. Even agricultural planning factored into defense, with emphasis placed on maintaining food production away from likely invasion zones. Each decision reflected a sober assessment of Australia's strategic isolation and limited manpower compared to potential adversaries. The environment itself posed challenges as formidable as any enemy. Soldiers stationed inland faced extreme heat, dust storms, water shortages, and isolation. Letters home describe endless horizons, mechanical breakdowns in scorching temperatures, and a strange mixture of boredom and underlying tension. Unlike combat units abroad, these personnel trained relentlessly for an event that might never come. Their discipline lay in readiness rather than engagement. When Japan's advance was halted in the Pacific and the likelihood of invasion diminished, relief was widespread but cautious. The infrastructure built during crisis did not vanish immediately. Instead, it became part of a new strategic baseline. In retrospect, the inland war effort represented a turning point in Australia's self-perception. It forced acknowledgement that geography could not guarantee immunity. It highlighted the importance of alliances within the Asia-Pacific region rather than reliance solely on distant Europe. It revealed the depth of indigenous knowledge in navigating and sustaining life across harsh terrain. And it demonstrated that national resilience depends as much on preparation and adaptation as on battlefield heroism. Today, travelers crossing Central Australia may encounter abandoned concrete slabs, unusual clearings, or fragments of rusted metal half buried in dust. To many, they appear insignificant relics, yet they are remnants of a moment when the continent quietly transformed into a defensive stronghold. Beneath the immense southern sky, far from the front lines that dominate textbooks, Australia prepared for survival with determination and ingenuity. The hidden inland war was not defined by explosions or dramatic last stands. It was defined by foresight, collaboration, and the understanding that sometimes the greatest victories are those that prevent devastation before it arrives. By the late 1940s, the dust of war had settled across the Australian interior, but the silence that returned to the desert was not the same silence that had existed before 1942. The land had absorbed convoys, aircraft, buried fuel, coded transmissions, and the anxious footsteps of a nation bracing for invasion. Although the immediate Japanese threat had disappeared, a new global tension was already forming. The Cold War emerged not with bombs over Australian skies, but with strategy rooms, intelligence briefings, and alliances quietly expanding in significance. Australia, having learned hard lessons about vulnerability, did not dismantle its inland strategic thinking. Instead, it refined it. The remote interior, once considered too harsh for development, was now viewed as an asset in a world divided by ideology and nuclear capability. In the early 1950s, defense cooperation with the United States deepened dramatically. The ANZUS Treaty formalized an alliance that had been forged in wartime necessity. American and Australian officials understood that geography made the continent uniquely valuable for surveillance and long-range monitoring. Central Australia's isolation, once perceived as emptiness, became strategic advantage. Remote regions offered minimal electromagnetic interference, vast secure perimeters, and political stability. These qualities would later support the establishment of joint defense facilities, including highly classified intelligence sites whose origins traced back to wartime inland operations. At the same time, Northern development policies accelerated. The wartime fear of sparse population returned in political rhetoric under the slogan, "Populate or Perish." Immigration programs brought hundreds of thousands of Europeans to Australian shores. Many settled in cities, but infrastructure investment extended inland as well. Roads were improved, air transport modernized, and resource surveys expanded. Geological mapping conducted urgently during the war now guided mining ventures in uranium and other minerals critical to atomic research. The desert that had once concealed fuel depots now concealed something else, strategic knowledge feeding into the nuclear age. Yet beneath these geopolitical shifts lay another untold transformation, the slow, complicated evolution of indigenous recognition. Aboriginal men who had assisted wartime patrols returned to communities still bound by restrictive protection acts. Despite service and cooperation, many remained excluded from full citizenship rights. However, the war had subtly altered perceptions. Some non-Indigenous Australians who had worked alongside Indigenous trackers and laborers could no longer easily dismiss their skill, discipline, or contribution. Personal experiences during crisis challenged entrenched stereotypes. While systemic change would take decades, seeds of awareness had been planted in unexpected places: rail depots, remote airstrips, and patrol camps where survival depended on shared effort. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Australia's interior once again hosted secretive operations, though now under the shadow of the Cold War. Rocket testing facilities at Woomera in South Australia became central to Anglo-Australian missile research. British nuclear tests conducted at sites such as Maralinga revealed the darker side of strategic ambition, with devastating impacts on local Indigenous communities. The inland war preparation of the 1940s had normalized the idea that remote Australia could serve global strategic objectives. But the consequences were uneven. For some regions, development brought employment and connectivity. For others, it brought displacement and contamination. These chapters remained controversial and for many years insufficiently acknowledged. Meanwhile, public memory continued to focus on heroic overseas campaigns. School textbooks highlighted Gallipoli's cliffs and Kokoda's jungles. Commemorations centered on sacrifice abroad. The inland defense effort of 1942-1943 lingered as a quiet subtext, referenced occasionally in political debate over the so-called Brisbane Line controversy, but rarely explored in full depth. It did not fit neatly into a narrative of dramatic confrontation. It was preventive history, measured in infrastructure built, plans drafted, and crises avoided. As archival materials gradually became accessible in the late 20th century, historians began piecing together the scale of inland mobilization. Memoranda detailed contingency evacuations of industry, fallback communication systems, and emergency governance protocols should northern cities fall. Maps revealed dispersed fuel storage networks stretching across remote corridors. Oral histories from railway workers described round-the-clock operations, moving troops and equipment through regions that had previously seen only livestock trains. Indigenous elders recounted strange wartime encounters, foreign uniforms appearing on sacred land, aircraft landing in unexpected clearings, whispered instructions delivered through interpreters. Each fragment expanded understanding of a chapter that had unfolded largely beyond public awareness. By the dawn of the 21st century, Australia's strategic posture still reflected lessons from 1942. Northern air bases were modernized, surveillance capabilities extended across maritime approaches. Joint facilities in Central Australia monitored global communications and missile trajectories. Though technology had evolved dramatically, the principle remained constant. Depth and distance were strategic strengths. The desert was no longer imagined as empty space, but as a protective interior anchored by infrastructure, alliances, and intelligence networks. Yet perhaps the most profound legacy of the hidden inland war lies not in hardware or treaties, but in perspective. The crisis forced Australia to reconsider its identity, not merely as a distant extension of Europe, but as a nation embedded in the Asia-Pacific. It demanded cooperation across cultural boundaries, even if recognition was imperfect and delayed. It revealed that resilience is not always forged in visible battle, but in readiness, planning, and collective endurance. The soldiers who trained for invasions that never came, the engineers who carved airstrips from red earth, the Aboriginal guides who navigated desert tracks under wartime secrecy, all participated in a defense that succeeded precisely because it was never fully tested. Today, travelers driving through Central Australia might pass remnants of wartime slabs or faint runway outlines barely distinguishable from surrounding plains. The wind moves across spinifex grass as it did long before 1942. The sky remains vast, stars burning intensely above ancient rock formations. On the surface, little suggests that the continent once braced for invasion from this very interior. Yet beneath that calm lay a memory etched into policy, alliance, and national consciousness. The hidden inland war reminds Australians that history does not unfold only where headlines shine brightest. Sometimes it unfolds in preparation rooms, in supply depots, in conversations between cultures learning to trust one another under pressure. It unfolds in the understanding that survival may depend as much on foresight as on firepower. Under the southern sky, Australia confronted vulnerability and responded not with spectacle, but with strategy. And in that quiet determination, spread across deserts and distant rail lines, the foundations of modern Australian security were firmly set. By the time the 20th century reached its final decades, the inland preparations of the 1940s had faded almost completely from public imagination, yet their influence pulsed quietly through every major defense decision Australia made. The desert had taught policymakers that remoteness was not weakness, but leverage. What had once been seen as empty space became a strategic canvas upon which new forms of security were painted. Satellite tracking stations, long-range communication arrays, and joint intelligence facilities were positioned far from crowded coastlines, protected by isolation and distance. The logic was simple. What could not easily be reached could not easily be destroyed. In Central Australia, installations such as Pine Gap emerged during the Cold War as symbols of deep alliance with the United States. Officially described in careful language, these facilities operated within layers of secrecy that echoed the wartime inland depots decades earlier. Signals intelligence, missile detection, and global surveillance linked the red heart of Australia to geopolitical tensions half a world away. While the Second World War had threatened invasion from the north, the Cold War introduced the possibility of nuclear exchange. Once again, the continent's interior became a shield, this time not against amphibious landings, but against the unpredictability of superpower rivalry. Communities near these installations experienced complex realities. Economic activity increased, infrastructure improved, employment opportunities expanded. Yet secrecy often created distance between civilians and operations conducted in their midst. Questions arose about sovereignty, foreign influence, and transparency. Protests occasionally gathered at the gates of remote facilities, reflecting broader debates about Australia's strategic direction. The hidden war of the 1940s had demonstrated the necessity of preparation, but the Cold War era forced Australians to confront the balance between security and independence. Meanwhile, historians and journalists continued uncovering fragments of the inland mobilization story. Declassified defense papers revealed just how close officials believed invasion might be in 1942. Private correspondence between political leaders showed disagreement over fallback strategies and resource allocation. Some documents suggested that industrial relocation plans had been drafted with remarkable detail, identifying specific factories for potential dismantling and reassembly further south. The scale of contingency planning astonished researchers who had previously assumed such measures were theoretical. What emerged was a portrait of a nation grappling earnestly with survival. For Indigenous Australians, the decades following the war brought both hardship and momentum for change. The 1967 referendum marked a watershed moment, symbolizing broader recognition of citizenship and inclusion. Yet the memory of wartime cooperation remained largely uncelebrated. Only gradually did academic studies begin documenting Aboriginal patrol units, labor contributions, and the strategic reliance on Indigenous environmental knowledge. Oral testimony became critical. Elders described guiding soldiers to hidden waterholes, explaining seasonal patterns, and witnessing convoys traverse sacred land. These accounts reframed the Inland War not merely as military logistics, but as intercultural encounter under extraordinary circumstances. Environmental consequences also surfaced over time. Wartime construction and later Cold War testing left physical imprints on fragile ecosystems. Abandoned equipment corroded in dry riverbeds. Sites used for weapons testing required remediation. Debates about land rights intersected with questions of contamination and responsibility. The desert, resilient yet vulnerable, became both witness and participant in national security history. Managing its legacy demanded cooperation among defense agencies, scientists, and traditional custodians. By the early 21st century, Australia's strategic landscape again shifted as attention returned to the Indo-Pacific. Maritime routes, cyber capabilities, and regional partnerships dominated headlines. Yet the foundational insight of 1942 persisted. Depth matters. Northern development initiatives sought to strengthen infrastructure across Darwin and surrounding regions. Military exercises expanded in scale and frequency, often conducted in remote training areas whose origins traced back to wartime necessity. Each exercise carried faint echoes of earlier preparations when invasion seemed imminent and survival uncertain. Public awareness of the hidden inland war has grown gradually through documentaries, museum exhibits, and academic research. Exhibitions in Darwin and Alice Springs now include references to emergency airstrips and dispersed fuel networks. Heritage listings protect some remaining wartime structures. Still, the story rarely commands the emotional weight of overseas campaigns. Perhaps its power lies precisely in its restraint. It is a narrative of readiness rather than tragedy, of prevention rather than defeat. It challenges audiences to consider that history's most decisive moments may occur in rooms where decisions are made long before conflict erupts. Looking back across 80 decades, the inland mobilization of World War II appears less like a footnote and more like a hinge. It marked the transition from imperial dependency to regional partnership, from complacent isolation to strategic vigilance. It exposed vulnerabilities, but also revealed strengths: geographic scale, adaptive infrastructure, and cultural knowledge rooted in millennia of custodianship. It laid groundwork for alliances that continue shaping policy. It influenced migration, industrial planning, and national identity. Under the immense southern sky, the red center remains deceptively tranquil. Tourists photograph Uluru at sunset, unaware that not far beyond the horizon, wartime runways once carved straight lines through scrubland. Freight trains cross desert tracks that carried troops and ammunition under blackout conditions. Communication towers rise where temporary signal posts once stood. The landscape appears eternal, yet layered within it are decades of preparation, anxiety, innovation, and transformation.
The hidden war beneath Australia's interior was never defined by invasion or victory parades. It was defined by foresight, by the willingness to confront vulnerability and respond with coordination and resolve. It demonstrated that national survival depends not solely on visible heroism, but on quiet determination sustained over vast distances. As Australia navigates new strategic uncertainties in the modern era, the lessons of that inland mobilization endure. The desert taught the nation that security is not static. It must be cultivated, reinforced, and adapted across generations. In the end, the story is not only about military strategy, it is about identity. It is about a continent recognizing its place in a turbulent region and choosing preparedness over denial. It is about alliances forged in crisis and knowledge shared across cultures. Beneath the brilliant constellations of the southern hemisphere, where the Milky Way stretches like a luminous river, Australia once prepared for a battle that never came. In doing so, it reshaped its future.
By the 1960s, the hidden legacy of Australia's inland mobilization had begun influencing broader societal and political consciousness, though much of it remained invisible to the public eye. The red interior, once a theater of emergency planning, was now interwoven with national infrastructure, scientific research, and emerging technological experimentation. The desert had ceased being merely a barrier. It had become a resource, a laboratory, and a strategic backbone for the country. One of the most significant transformations occurred in the field of science and defense collaboration. Remote sites that had initially served as emergency airstrips and fuel depots were repurposed for communications, meteorological observation, and missile testing. Woomera in South Australia became a central hub, bridging Australia's efforts with British aerospace and atomic research programs. The ethical and environmental consequences of these programs would become controversial in later decades, especially for indigenous communities whose lands were used for testing. Yet the wartime precedent, using the interior for strategic purposes, had normalized the concept, making large-scale remote installations politically feasible. Meanwhile, the memories of the 1940s mobilization persisted in the lives of those who had participated. Veterans of inland logistics, railway engineers, and indigenous guides carried stories of movement, observation, and survival that rarely appeared in official accounts. Letters and personal diaries described long convoys across red dust plains, nights under vast starlit skies, and the silent tension of preparing for a threat that might never materialize. These testimonies, often collected decades later by historians, revealed a dimension of Australian resilience that contrasted sharply with the more celebrated battlefront narratives abroad. Indigenous Australians, in particular, held nuanced perspectives. While many elders recounted cooperation with wartime forces, they also emphasized the intrusion upon sacred lands and the disruption of traditional life. Yet even within this tension, wartime collaboration offered subtle avenues for acknowledgement of Indigenous expertise, laying groundwork for later advocacy and eventual shifts in social policy. The stark desert, the harsh climate, and the cultural knowledge required to navigate both created a crucible of interdependence that transcended conventional hierarchies. Technological innovation also flourished as a consequence of inland operations. The requirement to monitor vast areas with minimal infrastructure led to early experimentation with remote communication systems, aerial reconnaissance, and radar installations that would later form the backbone of Australia's Cold War defense network. In effect, the Inland War served as a prototype for integrating geography, human skill, and emerging technology into national security strategy. Satellite imagery today reveals traces of some installations, faint runway outlines, abandoned fuel tanks, and maintenance pads, reminding observers of the scale of wartime preparation. In the political sphere, the inland mobilization contributed indirectly to debates about population distribution and economic development. The populate or perish policy of the post-war era reflected lessons learned during the 1940s. A sparsely populated nation is vulnerable, and geographic isolation alone cannot guarantee survival. New towns were planned, rail networks extended, and industries established farther inland than previously imagined. These efforts created a subtle yet enduring reshaping of Australia's internal geography, reflecting strategic foresight that combined both defense and developmental imperatives. At the same time, the Cold War era introduced a new dimension of secrecy. Information about inland installations, patrols, and intelligence networks was tightly controlled. Academic research only slowly began to reveal the scope of wartime preparation. Historians, piecing together correspondence, maps, and oral testimonies, discovered a nation operating with remarkable coordination and foresight, yet largely invisible to itself. This invisibility, paradoxically, became a defining characteristic of the inland mobilization. Its success lay not in public recognition, but in effectiveness without spectacle. As the decades progressed, public commemorations continued to emphasize overseas campaigns. Gallipoli, Kokoda, and later Vietnam dominated collective memory, while the deserts remained quiet, almost anonymous witnesses. Yet interest in hidden histories began growing among scholars, filmmakers, and educators. Documentaries examining Aboriginal contributions, logistical ingenuity, and emergency infrastructure development sought to bring these untold stories into public awareness. Oral histories, combined with declassified government records, gradually illuminated a chapter of Australia's past that had been largely invisible for half a century. The Inland War's lessons extended beyond strategy and logistics. It became a mirror reflecting societal dynamics, cultural collaboration, and the interplay between environment and human adaptation. Soldiers and engineers had to rely on indigenous expertise. Planners had to respect harsh climate realities. Policymakers had to anticipate threats that might never manifest. Australia's interior had become a proving ground not for battle, but for resilience, foresight, and strategic imagination. By the 1980s, remnants of these efforts were integrated into modern military doctrine, emergency management planning, and national infrastructure networks. The desert's role as a silent sentinel was now codified in policies emphasizing decentralization, disaster preparedness, and rapid mobilization. Though the public remained largely unaware of the full scope of wartime inland operations, the land itself retained the memory. Airstrips hidden beneath scrub, fuel caches buried beneath red dust, and paths once used to transport men, equipment, and hope across vast distances. Ultimately, the inland mobilization of the 1940s stands as a testament to Australia's ability to confront vulnerability with foresight. It demonstrates that history is not only made where battles are fought, but also where threats are anticipated, preparations executed, and survival ensured.
Beneath the southern sky, Australia's interior tells a story of strategy, collaboration, endurance, and hidden courage, a story that continues to shape the nation's identity, policy, and perception of its place in the world. By the early 1990s, the hidden inland war of World War II had begun to intersect with contemporary Australian identity in unexpected ways. Scholars, archaeologists, and journalists had started uncovering traces of wartime infrastructure, yet the significance of these discoveries extended beyond mere historical curiosity. The desert was not just a repository of past preparation. It was a living testament to the nation's capacity for adaptation, resilience, and foresight. Each abandoned runway, concealed fuel depot, or faint railway siding told a story of coordination and planning executed under extreme uncertainty. With the Cold War reaching its final stages, the strategic value of Central Australia remained undiminished. Satellite technology, which had evolved from rudimentary observation tools of the mid-20th century, now allowed for more precise monitoring of the vast interior. Intelligence facilities, initially established to observe potential Japanese activity, had adapted to monitor global developments. The lessons of 1942 to 43 proved timeless. Distance and isolation were assets, but only when combined with human ingenuity, technological foresight, and constant vigilance. Indigenous communities, whose wartime contributions had been largely unrecognized, began asserting their histories more publicly. Oral traditions, long confined to family and community circles, were being recorded for academic and cultural preservation. These narratives revealed critical knowledge, hidden water sources, safe desert pathways, and methods for enduring extreme conditions. Military and civilian historians alike acknowledged that much of the inland infrastructure could not have been built or maintained without this knowledge. Yet recognition had come slowly, highlighting the broader social inequities that persisted decades after the war. Environmental historians noted that the desert itself had been reshaped by wartime activities. Temporary airstrips, supply caches, and vehicle tracks altered soil composition, while testing exercises left subtle scars on native flora. Some of these changes facilitated later development, including the establishment of more permanent roads and research stations. Other impacts remained problematic, raising questions about how to preserve both historical sites and fragile ecosystems. The duality of progress and preservation became a recurring theme in Australian scholarship, a dialogue between remembering history and respecting the land. During this period, popular culture began to take an interest in hidden wartime stories. Documentaries, radio series, and regional museum exhibits highlighted Australia's inland mobilization, drawing attention to the complexity of wartime strategy. Filmmakers reconstructed secret convoys crossing endless red plains, soldiers training for scenarios that never occurred, and indigenous guides navigating terrain that modern maps could not adequately represent. These projects emphasized that heroism need not be measured solely in combat. Planning, adaptation, and survival were equally worthy of recognition. International collaborations also drew on Australia's inland wartime legacy. The strategic cooperation with the United States, formalized in alliances decades earlier, extended to research, joint exercises, and intelligence sharing. Analysts examined how the desert could function as a buffer, not just for regional defense, but for global monitoring purposes. In essence, the infrastructure and organizational knowledge developed during World War II provided a foundation for Australia's modern role in international security. Meanwhile, researchers began documenting the personal stories that had largely escaped archival attention. Letters, diaries, and interviews with veterans of inland operations revealed the human side of preparation. Soldiers recalled nights spent under starlit skies, sandstorms that immobilized convoys, and the quiet satisfaction of completing logistical tasks critical to national survival. Engineers recounted improvising solutions when water supplies failed or vehicles broke down.
Indigenous trackers described teaching newcomers how to read the land and navigate hidden hazards. These accounts transformed abstract strategic planning into a deeply human narrative, showing that history is constructed not only by grand policies, but also by daily decisions in extraordinary circumstances. By the mid-1990s, a more comprehensive understanding of Australia's inland war effort began emerging. Scholars emphasized three key themes: the role of geography as both barrier and asset, the indispensable contribution of indigenous knowledge, and the importance of foresight in shaping both national defense and identity. Conferences and publications increasingly acknowledged that the story of the Red Center was as much about adaptation and resilience as it was about military logistics. The narrative of preparation rather than direct combat challenged conventional ideas of heroism. Unlike Gallipoli or Kokoda, where physical confrontation dominated, inland operations required patience, ingenuity, and coordination across vast distances. Yet the impact was profound. Australia had endured one of the most uncertain periods in its history, and the inland mobilization had ensured that the nation remained intact, secure, and poised for future challenges. As the 21st century approached, interest in untold histories grew further. Historians, documentary filmmakers, and educators sought to illuminate these episodes not merely as wartime anecdotes, but as foundational chapters in Australian identity. The Inland War revealed that courage is not always measured by facing bullets. It can also be measured by anticipating danger, coordinating complex logistics, and relying on knowledge that has been accumulated over millennia.
Beneath the vast southern sky, the deserts of Australia continued to bear silent witness. The red earth absorbed the stories of planning, endurance, and adaptation. Abandoned airstrips, hidden depots, and traces of logistical networks remained visible only to those who knew where to look. Yet their presence silently affirmed a truth: that the survival and growth of modern Australia rested not just on victories overseas, but on meticulous preparation, human cooperation, and respect for the land itself. By the early 2000s, the hidden inland war of the 1940s had begun to be reframed not only as a historical curiosity, but as a defining moment in the shaping of modern Australia. Scholars, journalists, and filmmakers increasingly recognized that the story of the desert, its logistics, its secrecy, and its reliance on indigenous knowledge was critical to understanding how a geographically isolated nation confronted existential threats. Academic research revealed that the wartime inland mobilization had been far more sophisticated than previously believed. Emergency airstrips were mapped with precision, supply depots were interconnected across hundreds of kilometers, and contingency rail lines were planned to ensure rapid movement of troops and resources. These measures, combined with intelligence operations in remote regions, had created a national security network invisible to the public, yet vital to the survival of the country. Indigenous contributions received increasing acknowledgement during this period. Elders shared detailed accounts of guiding soldiers, locating hidden water sources, and interpreting terrain for those unfamiliar with the harsh desert environment. Their knowledge had made the difference between success and failure in navigation, construction, and survival. Historians emphasized that this collaboration, though under-recognized at the time, represented a critical intersection of cultural knowledge and military necessity, highlighting both the resilience of Indigenous Australians and the dependence of the broader nation on their expertise. Simultaneously, environmental historians examined the long-term impact of wartime activity on the interior. Temporary airstrips, fuel depots, and vehicle tracks had left lasting marks on ecosystems that were already fragile. Some of these sites were later purposed for scientific research, while others remained as remnants of an era when the desert had been pressed into service for national survival. Preservation efforts began in the 2000s, focusing on both historical documentation and ecological rehabilitation, creating a dual narrative of memory and conservation. The influence of inland mobilization also extended into contemporary strategic planning. Facilities developed during the Cold War had evolved from their wartime origins, leveraging the lessons learned from emergency operations decades earlier. Surveillance technology, remote communication, and rapid response logistics all bore the imprint of earlier experiences. Analysts studying the evolution of Australian defense strategy often cited the inland mobilization as a case study in the effective use of geography, population distribution, and cultural knowledge to ensure national security. Public awareness began to grow through media and cultural projects. Documentaries highlighted the desert as a space of preparation, secrecy, and resilience. Museum exhibits displayed artifacts recovered from abandoned depots and airstrips, while oral history projects collected personal narratives from veterans, engineers, and indigenous participants. These initiatives reshaped the public understanding of Australia's wartime experience, emphasizing that courage and heroism manifest not only in combat, but in meticulous planning, endurance, and foresight. At the same time, the narrative highlighted the broader societal implications of inland mobilization. The logistical and strategic efforts required coordination across communities, industries, and cultures, fostering a subtle sense of shared purpose. Northern development policies, population growth initiatives, and infrastructure expansion were all influenced by the lessons learned during wartime preparation. In many ways, the hidden inland war acted as a catalyst for national development, linking defense strategy with economic and social planning. International collaboration continued to be shaped by the inland legacy. The strategic relationship with the United States, forged during World War II and solidified in the Cold War, evolved to include joint exercises, intelligence sharing, and technological cooperation. Analysts frequently examined how Australia's vast interior could function as both a shield and an operational base, reinforcing the importance of geography in modern defense planning. Cultural memory, however, remained uneven. While overseas campaigns like Gallipoli and Kokoda retained their prominent place in public commemoration, the inland mobilization was still largely absent from school curricula and mainstream narratives. Historians argued that this invisibility reflected the preventive nature of the effort. Success had been measured not in dramatic battles, but in readiness and resilience. The quiet nature of this achievement made it harder to celebrate, but no less critical to the nation's survival. By the mid-2000s, the hidden inland war had become an object of interdisciplinary study. Military historians, environmental scientists, indigenous scholars, and political analysts converged in research examining the multiple layers of impact. They highlighted how geography, culture, logistics, and foresight combined to produce an outcome where disaster was avoided not by luck, but by careful preparation. The desert, previously considered empty and isolated, was recast as a space of ingenuity and strategic depth. Under the southern sky, the echoes of 1942 continued to resonate. The red earth retained faint traces of past activity, airstrips, supply depots, and vehicle tracks, reminders of a time when a continent prepared for invasion that never came. The land itself became a repository of memory, silently preserving the lessons of endurance, collaboration, and foresight. For modern Australians, understanding this hidden chapter offered both a window into the past and a guide for navigating future uncertainties. In sum, the inland mobilization exemplified a different kind of heroism, one measured in strategy, preparation, and human cooperation across vast distances. It demonstrated that the survival and growth of a nation could depend as much on foresight and organization as on combat valor. And while the story remained largely untold in popular culture, it continued to shape Australia's identity, defense strategy, and appreciation of its own land, a silent testament to resilience beneath the southern sky.
By the early 2010s, the legacy of Australia's hidden inland war had evolved from secrecy to recognition. Scholars, filmmakers, and educators increasingly highlighted the role of the interior not only as a site of wartime preparation, but as a symbol of national resilience. Remote airstrips, abandoned supply depots, and faint railway tracks were studied, mapped, and in some cases preserved, creating a tangible link to a period when the continent had quietly prepared for threats that never arrived. Indigenous narratives became central to this reinterpretation. Elders spoke of their ancestors' guidance during wartime operations, sharing knowledge of waterholes, safe desert tracks, and seasonal patterns critical to survival. These stories were integrated into museum exhibits, school programs, and documentaries, emphasizing that the interior's strategic importance had been inseparable from indigenous expertise. The Inland War was no longer a story of military logistics alone. It was also a story of intercultural collaboration, resilience, and adaptation in the harshest of landscapes. Environmental and historical preservation efforts flourished. Sites previously used for secretive operations were studied for their ecological and historical significance. Restoration projects addressed contamination from abandoned facilities, while interpretive trails allowed visitors to experience portions of the desert's wartime history. Through these efforts, Australians could engage with a history that had long been invisible, discovering how foresight, collaboration, and respect for the land had preserved both life and culture. Strategically, the lessons of 1942 to 43 continued to influence national defense. Modern facilities, from intelligence centers to surveillance arrays, drew inspiration from inland operations. The principle of using geography as a defensive asset remained central, and Australia's collaboration with international partners, particularly the United States, retained elements rooted in wartime contingency planning. The interior had proven that preparation and knowledge, human, technological, and environmental, could deter catastrophe without firing a shot. Cultural memory finally began to reflect the Inland War's quiet heroism. Veterans of logistics, engineers, and indigenous guides were recognized for their contributions. Documentaries and literature highlighted the endurance required to maintain readiness in the desert. Long convoys across red dust, nights under starlit skies, improvisation in extreme conditions, and the coordination of multiple communities over hundreds of kilometers. This recognition transformed the narrative of courage to include foresight, planning, and adaptation alongside traditional battlefield valor. In retrospect, the inland mobilization offers a profound lesson for Australia and beyond. Survival is rarely guaranteed by geography alone. Strength lies in preparation, collaboration, and the willingness to anticipate threats long before they arrive. The deserts of central and northern Australia, once perceived as empty and isolated, had quietly held the key to national security. They were repositories of human ingenuity, cultural knowledge, and strategic foresight. Today, travelers crossing the red interior may see nothing more than endless horizons, wind-shaped dunes, and the glittering southern sky. Yet beneath the surface lies the imprint of a hidden chapter in Australian history, a story of vigilance, resilience, and unity. The Inland War did not end with a climactic battle. It ended with the preservation of a nation, its culture, and its identity. It is a story of triumph without combat, of preparation without recognition, and of a land and its people rising to meet uncertainty with courage and intelligence.
As Australia faces new challenges in a complex 21st century world, the lessons of the hidden inland war endure. They remind us that true strength is often unseen, that heroism can take many forms, and that the land itself, its harsh deserts, vast plains, and red horizons, is as much a participant in history as any person. Beneath the southern sky, the desert still whispers its secrets, a testament to foresight, endurance, and the untold chapters that quietly shaped a nation.